Okay, so what we have done so far is basically just to introduce the topic, what dependent origination is in summary, and kind of how you know that something is dependent origination, what is and what is not. So now we're going to just do a little bit more by way of background before we get to the individual factors. I don't know, sometimes one of the, I think, most important things of any kind of teaching is to understand the broader framework. And when you understand the broader framework, then very often the little parts, they kind of fall into place quite easily. So this is a little bit about understanding the framework of dependent origination, what it is about and how it functions. This first point here, ignorance leading to suffering, this is kind of really what dependent origination is about. There is a problem in life to be solved. That problem is called suffering, or it can be called lack of contentment, lack of satisfaction, lack of happiness, or problems in life, or however you want to look at it. It can be called death, it can be called old age, it can be called of basically anything you like, but it kind of is summarized in the idea of suffering, which is dukkha in Pali, by the way. So let's get the dukkha right here. So this is the dukkha, and it is so this is the issue that the Buddha starts with. And of course, that is the Four Noble Truths. First noble truth is the truth of dukkha. Dukkha satcha. Satcha is the Pali for truth. So this analyzes why there is suffering and brings it back to the kind of root problem. The root problem is then called avidya in the Pali. Avidya being here ignorance. And dependent origination is then the kind of shows us how you start with avidya, how you start with ignorance, and how that actually leads to suffering. What is the kind of the transformation that is required from ignorance so that this actually leads to suffering? And that these 12 factors of dependent origination show us that transformation. But actually, it's also very intuitive, right? It's kind of obvious in a sense. If you are deluded about things, if you're ignorant about things, you make mistakes, because you don't understand things as they actually are. So it kind of is obvious that you're going to suffer if you are deluded or ignorant. If you get up in the morning and you want to go down to the shops to buy yourself some breakfast or whatever, and you don't know the way to the shops and you go in the wrong direction, you're going to suffer, It's small suffering, but it's still suffering. You don't get your breakfast. And early in the morning, before you're going to go to work or before you're going to have the workshop here, or whatever it is, you need some sustenance to get it going through the day. So ignorance leads to suffering. You're going to invest on the stock market. Does anyone here invest on the stock market? No, but if you do, and you can have a bad stockbroker who gives the bad information, you invest in the wrong stocks, you lose all your money, that's called suffering. We need a little bit of money, it comes in very handy in life. So it is kind of very intuitive that ignorance and delusion must lead to suffering. But dependent origination is a particular way of looking at this problem. And this is why it is so interesting, because it comes back to the root problem of our existence as human beings, or any kind of being for that matter. You want to talk about this? This is your area.
Is that?
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
Universal principle. Actually, let's just quickly go through the 5 points. Let's quickly go through these 5 points. So this is the idea that dependent origination is a universal principle. It is not a kind of a specific teaching that is applicable in certain circumstances, or it is a teaching that only is relevant to Buddhism. The idea the Buddha says is that this is a discovery of the nature of reality. This is kind of the idea here. And this is an important point, because the whole point of the Buddhist teaching is that it teaches us, from the Buddhist point of view, a insight into the reality of things, what things actually are like. So it's a universal principle. It's a very profound teaching, because it kind of brings together so many different aspects of Buddhism into one place. It brings in some of the psychological teachings. We saw that before about the kind of the what is called proliferation of the mind and these kind of things. And it brings that together with the idea of non-self and how that is conceived of in comparison to the existing religions, the Brahmanical religions and these kind of things. And we'll see later on how more about this profundity of these teachings. It's a very rich teaching. Almost all of Buddhism can be summarized or found within dependent origination. And seeing it, if you understand dependent origination, basically that means that you are a stream entry. In other words, you have insight, full insight into the Dhamma teachings. This is why ignorance leads to suffering. you are blind, you're walking in darkness, and because you're blind and walking in darkness, you walk off. Isn't there a cliff somewhere in Sydney where people walk off if they are ignorant? Yeah, the gap. Yeah, so that's kind of this. This might be the gap. Yeah. Okay, your turn.
So, yeah. So you know the story of what happened? There used to be, you know the story of the dog that used to save people at the Gap? You know that story?
I have a vague
So years ago, because the Gap is of course a place where, the Gap at Sydney Heads, where people commit suicide. And years ago, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a pub nearby, and the owner of the pub had a dog. And the dog used to save people. It was a German Shepherd, and he used to run down when people were going to throw themselves off, and it used to bark, and it used to grab them, and it used to pull them back from the edge. And so this dog became a kind of urban legend in Sydney because it saved so many people's lives. And I remember reading an article about this in the paper some years ago, and they finished the article by saying, if you go there these days, there's a sign on the path saying dogs not allowed. So that's ignorance, right? Okay, so the idea of a universal principle is that in Buddhism that, or just the idea that the truths that the Buddha was talking about are something that's not something that he invented, it's not something that's specific to a particular time or place or culture, but it's something which pertains to the human condition and even non-human condition. Aliens and beings in other realms and so on also suffer from dependent origination or experience dependent origination.
That's not a joke, by the way, that aliens, right?
No, oh God, no.
Yeah.
Oh, please, yes, thank you.
Be clear about that.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah.
So this is called, in Buddhism, called Dhamma Titata, the regularity or the law of nature, Dhamma Niyamata, this regularity of natural principles, Dhamma Titata, invariance of natural principles, the Dhamma Niyamata, the specific conditionality, Idapachayata. And so the Buddha, specifically in this context of dependent origination, talked about how this was something that he discovered. He also used the simile of coming across an ancient city that was buried in the forest, hence, incidentally, discovering archaeology when he did so. Right? Anyway, okay. And in this way, that the principles of Buddhism are similar to the laws of science. All right? And one of the things about this is the idea of a law and what a law means. There are two kinds of laws. There are laws that describe and laws that prescribe. Laws that describe are laws that say this is the kind of thing that happens. Laws that prescribe are the things that say this is the kind of thing that should happen. So a law that prescribes is something like a speed limit is 60 kilometers an hour, and if you go faster than that, cops will pull you over and say you've got to go below that speed limit. So the laws that are prescriptions are laws that change the way things happen. They're laws that make things work in a certain way. But the natural laws, the laws of nature, the laws of science, all the laws of Buddhism are not that kind of law at all. And this is something which I think gets often misunderstood. Even scientists often misunderstand this. They think that the laws of nature tell things what to do. So that if I drop a pen, the law of gravity tells the pen to fall down, right? Of course, it doesn't do any such thing. The law of gravity describes what we observe when we observe pens falling down. It's a descriptive law, and it doesn't actually exist in nature. There's no such thing as a law of gravity in nature. The law of gravity is an abstraction that human beings made in order to describe what they see in nature. And you see this regularity. Yeah? And so what the Buddha, the kind of natural law in Buddhism is the same kind of thing. It's what's called a panyati. So dependent origination is a panyati which describes a regularity that can be observed in nature. Yeah? And so this kind of idea of dependent origination as a prescriptive law, as a descriptive law, which points to the regularity and the patterns of the unfolding of things in nature, and that regularity is persistent. All right. So just in the same way that the law of gravity is persistent, different parts of the universe, different times and different places, the law of gravity still describes things as they happen. So dependent origination is still persistent. It doesn't mean that there's an existing thing that lasts throughout all of time that is telling things what to do. But what it means is that wherever you are and whenever you are, you can always describe the experience of sentient beings in that same way. And that's what we call the law of dependent origination. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay.
But there is a connection between the descriptive laws and the prescriptive laws, right? Which is, but you have to explain this because this is your...
No, I don't.
Is there an explanation?
I'll explain what I bloody well want to. Don't tell me what I have to explain.
Okay, I'm just making that statement. This is a statement.
Well, there is a connection in the sense that if we... there's a connection in the sense... I'm sorry. There's a connection in the sense that... how we live should be in accordance with those natural laws. So the should follows that once you've observed that, right? So once you've observed this is how the law of nature lives, this is how the law of gravity is, right? The law of gravity, we know that the law of gravity isn't making things fall, but things still fall, right? That's the point. So if I'm designing a bridge or a building, then I want to take that into account, right? And the fact that we have a law means that we have a predictable and reliable way of describing that, so that way engineers can do their job and so on. And so we have to, if we want to be effective and to live effectively, we have to live in accordance with those laws. The same thing with dependent origination. We understand how those principles live, and the should follows along. Once we understand this is how things work, if I'm going to have craving, ow, I'm going to suffer. We know that. So then the should comes in and say, if you don't want to suffer, I mean, maybe you do want to suffer. Okay, fine, have as much craving as you like. But if you don't want to suffer, then let go of your craving. And when you understand that law, then actually life becomes very easy, actually. Just like if you understand the laws of physics, it becomes easy to do something like build a house or, you know, all of the things we can do with our technology and so on. You know, with this room, all of the things you can do because we understand those laws of nature. We can make a light globe, we can make carpet, we can make buildings, we can all of these things because we understand how those laws work and we work in accordance with those laws. So the same thing happens with dependent origination. If once we understand it, then we can start to live in accordance with that. And you realize, oh, actually, this suffering that I'm experiencing, it doesn't just happen. It's not just random, it happens because of a cause. And you can look back and understand, that's where it comes from. And then, when you live more in accordance with that, then you'll find that that suffering will lessen and go away.
What is kind of interesting about this is actually, of course, one of the differences between the laws that you find in the suttas, in the Dhamma, and the laws that you find in physics or you find in the natural sciences is that these are really laws about the mind, laws about the mental world. And because they are laws about the mental world, that's why they also then relate to morality, because morality, of course, also is a mental thing. So these things kind of come together like that. But in a sense, it kind of it stretches over, though. It goes beyond just the mental, because things like birth and death would normally be considered physical things, things that happen in the physical world. So it kind of bridges the gap somehow between the physical and the mental, which is kind of fascinating here. And I guess that our normal ideas about the distinction between the physical world and the mental world are not as strong in Buddhism at all as they are in a kind of ordinary life, where we think of the physical and the mental as two different realms. Whereas in Buddhism, these things are actually very closely related to each other. And that opens up kind of a whole kind of different worldview in the Buddhist suttas than what you normally have in the kind of how we normally think about the world. So how do you see that connection between the the mental and the physical. I mean, if you look at dependent origination, you talk about both mental and physical phenomena in one, pretty much in one go. How would you kind of unify that?
Well, I think that the difference, I mean, one of the things that because I studied Western philosophy, and one of the things that the way that problem is approached in Western philosophy is basically that you have these incompatible things. How do you combine them? You have a mind and a body, or you have a body and a soul, or whatever, however you conceive it. How do you actually stick these two things together? But it's interesting, like this is a philosophical problem. And Nicola asked before about like the relationship of dependent origination with mythology, right? Now it's actually the way that philosophical problems are framed and put makes it sound like they are purely rational problems. All right? So you might ask a question like, how does the mind relate to the body? It sounds like a purely rational and philosophical problem, okay? But it's interesting that that problem doesn't get framed in that way in Indian philosophy, so far as I know, at all, right? I don't know. In Western philosophy, it's one of the major problems, which is, you know, a bugbear of the whole Western philosophical system. Now, Western philosophical system comes back to Socrates and so on, but it also goes back to the Bible, to the beginning of the Bible, where you have Adam lying down there, made of clay, and then God comes and breathes the life into him. So you can see the problem here, that you have two quite distinct things, a lump of clay and the breath of life from God. And how do you get these two things to stick together? Right? Now, if you look at it from a purely theological point of view, it's not really a problem. But if you want to make it into a rational philosophy, it becomes very problematic. How do you stick the mind and the body together? And that problem in philosophy comes because of the inherited assumptions that have been formed by the mythological context that people don't really think about because it's embedded in the way that you approach problems at such a basic level. And in Indian philosophy, we never really had that problem because we don't think about things in that same way. So from a Buddhist point of view, you start with the soup. This is what we got, right? What is all this? What's going on? It's all this stuff's happening. You're seeing things. You're hearing things. You're feeling things. There's emotions. There's sensations. There's all of this stuff is happening, and it's all this mix of stuff we can't make sense of. That's our starting point. So our starting point isn't an idea that there are these two pure entities that have to be combined. Our starting point is that this is that realm of experience that we actually live in, and all of this stuff is happening. Then, once we have that starting point, we can start to look at it analytically and say, well, some of these things that we're experiencing have certain kinds of qualities. For example, it might have a quality of resistance. I can hit it, and it hits back, right? Like this table. Other things have different qualities, like the concept of freedom, for example. Right? You can't hit it. It doesn't have resistance. It doesn't have that same quality. So different aspects of our experience have different kinds of qualities, and we can start to draw those out and classify them. We say, well, certain qualities are physical qualities, certain qualities are mental qualities, and so on. And these are things which we've abstracted from our experience, and we've described in a certain way. And so, but the abstraction is secondary. The original is the mix. So in the Buddhist philosophy, you start from the mix and then you abstract them, rather than the Western philosophy where you start with them separate and then you have to combine them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, you know, sometimes in these days a very common thing they talk about in philosophy is what they call the hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness arise from material phenomena? And it seems utterly unsolvable, but basically the whole problem is an artifact of how we approach it, and may not be a problem at all. It may just be a kind of a stupid way of, well, not the stupid maybe, but comes from certain assumptions basically. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Mm. You have a big problem, don't you? If there's a God, you have a serious problem. That's right.
Sorry? Who created the first person? Okay. Very good, thank you. Okay, so just first thing, just to clarify, when I said before that you start with the mess of all of the things that's happening, I wasn't meaning that that's like a start in a metaphysical sense, right? It's not like the start of everything. I'm just saying that when we begin our reflection and our examination of what our life is, then that's what our life is. That's where we start. We're here, and we start with what we've got. Okay, so that's not. I wasn't talking about the origins of things there. Okay, that's one question. So the question of where things begin, the ultimate point of things, the Buddha said, is unknowable. So anamatagyo ko ayang sangsaro. Yeah? And the first point of things is unknowable, right? The pubbakoti, right? Literally the first point of things. So most of the time with creation myths, that there's a first point. So you begin in the beginning. And the Buddha said we can't really know what was happening in the beginning. And this is absolutely a critical point for the Buddha's philosophy, because the Buddha's philosophy explicitly acknowledges the limits of knowledge. Yeah? It explicitly acknowledges the limits of knowledge, and that there are certain things that we can't know, and that doesn't mean that the philosophy is broken or inadequate in any way. In order to be able to know things, we have to be able to limit our knowledge. This is one of the paradoxes of knowledge. I'm going to be talking more about, I'm doing a course called Early Buddhist Theory of Knowledge at the Buddhist Library coming up in July, and I'm going to be talking more about these issues at that point. But it's very interesting that if you look at the histories of science, then the histories of science also move in a similar way. Earlier on, the histories of scientists have this idea that they can explain everything. And as they go on, they tend to drop that assumption and to accept the fact that there are certain things that will never be explainable. And that's a major shift, especially in 20th century philosophy. So the Buddha never explained where does the first person come from, or even whether that idea of the first person makes sense. But what he said was that this is something that goes beyond our capacity to know. You're looking up that sutta?
Yeah, I'm just going to bring up one of the suttas that I've read to this particular point. So
Yeah, anamatago ko ayang sangsara.
that one, I was going to bring another one.
Okay,
Yeah.
go on, bring another one.
Just to kind of
Just to mess with our heads.
just mess with our heads and everything. This is good sutta.
Which one's this?
Yes, this is the one which starts off here. Yeah, Mendicants, it is said that no first point of ignorance is evident.
Do you want to just control expand it a
Expand it
couple?
more? Okay.
Yeah, a couple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sound.
Oh, sound, right. Sound. No, you.
Okay, I'll read that. Okay. So this is one of the suttas that talks about this particular point. Yeah, what is the beginning of things? And the Buddha says, Mendicants, it is said that no first point of ignorance is evident, before which there was no ignorance, and afterwards it came to be. And this is a standard thing that you see throughout the sutta. Sometimes it talks about the first point of ignorance, sometimes it says the first point of being, or the first point of the world. There's different ways of saying the same thing. So the idea is that Buddhism is one of the only places where there is no first point. Almost everywhere else, any other religion, even in science, they have a first point called the Big Bang. So science is, in a sense, similar to, well, that's what they say sometimes, yeah. And there was a famous scientist, I'm not sure which one it was now, but the famous scientist who said something to the effect that, give us one free miracle and we can explain everything else. The free miracle is the Big Bang. Everything else we can explain because they cannot, So Buddhism, to me, is the only kind of, as far as I'm concerned, the rational explanation, because there is things just go back. There's always causes before the causes. But if you have a first point, then you have to explain it with some kind of supernatural thing, like God created the world, But that doesn't explain anything, because what about God? You might as well say the universe was always there. It makes no difference whether you say God created the universe or you say the universe was always there. It amounts to the same thing. There's no explanatory power, as they say, in the idea of adding God to the equation. So in a sense, the Buddhist way of thinking about this is far superior to as far as I'm concerned anyway, I'm a Buddhist of course, but it's far superior to many of these other ways, including the scientific idea that the universe began with the Big Bang. So
I think that's a bit of reductive description of the scientific point of view. But anyway, fair enough.
but that is sometimes how they describe it, maybe for polemical purposes or for kind of popular purposes.
I don't know if a physicist would.
I think so. Absolutely. Yeah, I say it does. Yeah, I say that.
All right.
Maybe not all of them, of course, because they're all different. But yeah. Anyway, so that's my.
One interesting point here with the Pali is the word I'm translating here as the first point of ignorance is evident. So the word here is the word here. Thank you, Radha. No first point is evident. And that was, remember, just a little while ago I was talking about how dependent origination is a description. So the word I'm using for description is panyati. It's the same word here as panyayati in the verb form. So it's phrased a little bit differently, but it's the same basic idea that it's something which can be, panyayati literally means to be made known. So something when there's no pubakoti, no purimakoti that is panyayati, that is made known or that appears or is evident. And so this is this idea that what we're doing is we're talking about a description or a way of making known what these things are. In this case, ignorance. Yep. Okay.
Is it my turn or your turn?
Oh, I'll go.
You go.
Okay.
Continue talking.
What are we doing?
You're on the roll.
I'm on the roll. Sure.
Yeah.
This will end well.
Okay.
What do we got next?
Next one. Okay. Oh, this is this one. Dig in the kind 15.
Yeah. I don't want to linger too much on these ones because I think we're saying the same things again. But just to say briefly that in this particular context, Venerable Ananda got schooled by the Buddha because he said, okay, this is not too hard. And the Buddha then gave him the Mahanidana Sutta, which is the most complex sutta on dependent origination. One of the interesting things about which is that it's the most complex sutta on dependent origination, but it actually has a shorter sequence. Like it actually skips some of the links. So the idea that more links means later obviously doesn't really hold good in that particular case. Clearly,
it adds one link, which kind of makes the whole difference.
Right. Yeah. So that's so what the Buddha is showing here is that there are many sort of hidden and subtle ramifications and implications of dependent origination, which even someone with Ananda's wisdom still could learn from. I mean, the Mahanidana Sutta is such a powerful and rich sutta. We could do the whole course on that one. Yeah.
Maybe we do. Should we do that?
Maybe we should.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go on. Yeah, let's go on. No, because there's other things I want to talk about that are more fun. That's all. Let's go. Okay. So this is the quote that the Buddha says at that time. And again, this is one of the many reasons for understanding that dependent origination is talking about rebirth. You hear the Buddha's quite explicit about that it's understanding it is how you get out of rebirth, and with that very kind of vivid imagery.
It's nice imagery, isn't it?
Tangled like string, knotted like a ball of thread, matted like rushes and reeds. Okay, let's go. Go on. Do you want to talk on this one? I want to get to the
yeah, let's get to the myth. Okay, yeah. So this is just just to point out that so much of the Dhamma is actually included in the idea of dependent origination. Yeah, we've already seen that rebirth is absolutely fundamental. In fact, it is without rebirth, it isn't even called dependent origination, really. So obviously, it is fundamental to it. We have the idea of kamma is included in dependent origination. We have the word sankhara as a second factor is actually just a way of talking about kamma. Sankhara really means kamma in the sense of intention. Yeah, intention is kamma. So sankhara is just another word for intention, really. So that's kind of fundamentally included in it. The five aggregates. Well, the five aggregates are basically the process of what it means to be a human being. Yeah, it's kind of our experience of the world. We experience the world as the five aggregates. And dependent origination can be regarded as a way of thinking about the five aggregates, the evolution of the five aggregates, how they evolve over time. That is one way of thinking about dependent origination. So it shows us how the five aggregates recreate themselves, how they perpetuate themselves, and also process by which that happens. Yeah, the various sub-factors of the aggregates, how they kind of work together to make this process function. The process of perception, this is the ordinary process in daily life, how we perceive things. By process of perception, I mean how it is that our sense organs, how we attend to certain things, and then what we make out of those things that we attend to. And this is what we're looking at before. We're looking at the ideas of mental proliferation, for example. And the idea of mental proliferation in Buddhism is how we tend to not stop at the mere sense data as such, but we make more out of it. We make a self out of it. We make craving out of it. We make views out of it. These three things are very important in Buddhism. The idea of craving, views, and the conceit of a self. These are three fundamental proliferations that arise out of the raw sense data of the world. And this process of perception shows us how we kind of build up fantasies out of and this also is then it becomes a sub-factor of dependent origination. The six senses, that's actually that's even a separate factor. In fact, the factor is salayatana, which really means both the internal and external, doesn't it? So it's both the senses and the sensed, really. But the senses are there. The three characteristics, another very important teaching in the Buddhism. Of course, the purpose of the three characteristics, which is there are impermanence, suffering, and non-self. And the purpose of this teaching is to basically to lean us in the direction of how to investigate the world in terms of insight meditation in particular. We investigate the world in these ways. Especially what we investigate is the five khandhas. This is also implied because avidya, at the very root of this, is a lack of understanding of these three characteristics specifically. Importance of death, this gets more practical, right? Importance of death. This is one of the things that kind of hit me a while ago, is that very often when we talk about suffering in the suttas, the Buddha singles out death as the kind of things that brings suffering together in one point, and because the dying experience is such that very many of the things that we suffer from in daily life, they are brought together in the moment of dying, because we have to let go massively. Everything is being taken away from us when we die. So at the end of dependent origination, instead of just saying birth leads to suffering, the Buddha says specifically birth leads to old age and death. Death is the big one at the end there. And I think there is a reason for that, because death is like a summary, in a sense, of all the aspects of suffering made into one particular point of life. So the importance of death in Buddhism, and one of the things that is also very obvious when you read the suttas, is that the contemplation of death, the perception of death, is actually a very important reflection and an important investigation as part of the spiritual path. Ignorance, knowledge, again, very obviously very important part of this, ignorance being the very first factor of dependent origination, knowledge being the first factor of dependent cessation. Dependent cessation is the whole sequence coming to an end. It starts off with the arising of knowledge at the very beginning here. The Four Noble Truths, also part of this, because this is kind of the framework for the very first factor. The first factor was defined as not knowing the Four Noble Truths. So everything is there. You can take any teaching you want from the suttas and you will find it in here. The only thing that is kind of partly missing, or you have to really read into it a bit more carefully, is the path itself. But that too can actually be extracted from the dependent origination if you know how to look for it, which you do after 25 years. So that's kind of the advantage of being a monk, or a nun or whatever. And this is what it looks like in artistic form. So this is what it feels like. Whoa, that's pretty scary. Maybe. So this is you see the outer rim there is the 12 factors of dependent origination in the outer rim. If you look carefully, you will be able to see the various factors. They are kind of depicted there in certain ways. And at the very center of the wheel, you have the greed, hatred, and delusion, which are considered the three kind of roots of the problem. And then the six. What are the six main sections outside there?
They're the 6 realms.
6 realms. That's what 6 realms. Okay.
So these are the 6 realms.
Yeah. And the beast on the outside is Yama, isn't it?
That's right, yeah, that's there.
The Lord of Death. Yeah.
And then these are the five khandhas.
Aha. Okay.
So these are the things. If you look at it closely, and each of them has a sort of stylized representation of the
12 factors of dependent origination. Yeah.
And obviously that's a really effective teaching tool, right? I mean, if you've got it on a big wall in the monastery or something like that.
Right. This is called a mandala, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's equally, it's both an exposition for explaining dependent origination and as a way of keeping novices in line.
That's good, actually. Yeah, okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, anyway.
Okay.
You want to talk?
What am I going to talk? Okay.
Just talk.
I'll just talk randomly. All right, so in Buddhism we have a goal of our practice, and the goal of our practice is to get enlightened. And the Buddha described enlightenment as he described everything, with a lot of clarity and analytic precision. And rather than talking about enlightenment as some kind of vague and unknowable state, he pointed to specific things that characterized enlightenment and the path towards enlightenment. And in particular, he talked about 4 stages in which enlightenment happens: stream entry, once return, non-return, and arahant. That's Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, and arahant. And the stream enterer, the Sotapanna, the first person, the person who reaches that first stage, realizes and sees dependent origination. And so this is one of the ways of characterizing stream entry, that is the vision of the Dhamma, is through the seeing of dependent origination. And I think it's worth emphasizing that, because sometimes people say, oh, dependent origination is too complicated, it's only for monastics or something like that, or it's only for arahants or something like that. But that's not what the Buddha said. The Buddha said actually it's important for everybody to understand it. And you know, as we like one of the things about wisdom, all right? We talked before about like that idea of like you can compact dependent origination and then expand it out, right? And one of the ways that wisdom works is that essentially the more wisdom you have, then the less you need to expand it out, right? If you've got a lot of wisdom, you can get just a short teaching and then you get it. Right? That's what wisdom is. Wisdom is being able to see something and see it. It's like Sherlock Holmes. He could walk into the room and say, oh yes, I can see that there's that mud on that person's shoes. So that same mud there was a damp spot outside the window. So they must have been the one who crawled inside the window that killed the old auntie. Right? And then he can deduce the whole thing from just seeing a bit of mud on the shoes. That's one kind of wisdom. Yeah? But the basic idea here is that with only a small bit of information, he could come to that conclusion. So the same thing with wisdom and spiritual wisdom is that some people, the Buddha would just say, everything's impermanent. And they'd be going, oh yeah, you're right. Yeah? Some people he'd teach in more detail. Some people have to practice for many years. Some people maybe have to practice for many lifetimes. And Yankinchi Samudaya. Yeah. So these Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang sabbantang nirodha dhammanti. Yes, whatever subject to arising is subject to cessation. So what the point here is that a stream enterer, you know, someone might ask, oh, do I have to study dependent origination to become a stream enterer, right? But you're looking at it the wrong way. The point is that these teachings are not like stumbling blocks that the Buddha's sort of made as a requirement before you can become a stream enterer. Right? He's not like making it hard for you, so you have to do all these things. He's giving you things that can help you to let go. Is it necessary for everyone to attend a course on dependent origination to become a stream enterer? Probably not. Okay? Is it going to be helpful? I hope so. Or at least we can enjoy spending some time together. I don't know, we could be doing worse things, you know. We could be going over to the racetrack and wasting our money gambling, so it's better than that. But anyway, every little bit of wisdom that we get, every little bit of insight that we get is going to help us to see things more clearly. And so for a stream enterer, they actually have that vision of what these things are. The Buddha said stream entry is like a flash of lightning in the dark of the night. And you just suddenly, all of these things that you've intuited and thought about and conceived and understood and so on, suddenly you just see them. And, yeah. Okay? Continue. Noble method. What is the noble method? Nyaya, that they have clearly seen and comprehended, probably tends to dependent origination. Yeah. So this is again just saying the same thing. So the nyaya is an interesting word, and it's kind of a curious one to sort of get exactly right. But yeah, noble method is probably as good as any. I can't remember what I chose for that. I wrote this whole essay about it. Now I can't remember what I ended up concluding. Okay, continue.
That's very good of you.
Okay, so what are we going to talk about now?
I don't know.
We're going to look at the Rig Veda stuff.
Yeah, but I think these pictures are quite interesting in their own right, aren't they?
Well, tell us about this.
Yeah.
This is very ancient. The whole code of
Yeah.
thing. That's a very recent. We
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't find any pictures.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you have a point, but I couldn't find any pictures that were kind of early here, contemporary here.
maybe no more than 3 centuries old.
Yeah, yeah.
Associated
Yeah.
with particular political movements.
Ganesh is only 3 centuries old.
Yeah.
In terms of having a cult, I mean, maybe in the Puranas, it's there.
Yeah.
Like the emergence of Ganesh.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Okay. The question is that there was a complaint about the picture, the graphics here, because saying that this picture Ganesh is only kind of 3 centuries. The depiction of Ganesh is that only 3 centuries ago. Is that right, Venerable Suvira? Yeah. Yeah, very recent. Yeah. So it doesn't really reflect early Buddhism. It doesn't reflect kind of the situation as it was in India 2,500 years ago. And that's, I think, is a very good point. But
I also object to the. I think that Ganesh and the Buddha would get along quite okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Ganesh seems like a fairly amiable
yeah.
fellow.
Object.
Well, I don't know. I don't know much about Ganesh and so on, but he seems like a fairly amiable chap, and I don't know. I think they'd probably get along fine.
Yeah.
They might have some, disagreement.
Actually, it'd be Paruleka forest. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's this whole elephant coming and offering to the Buddha. Anyway, thank you. But what's the point here? What are we talking about?
What is this?
Okay. Go on.
This is your area of expertise.
Is it? Okay. Crikey. All right. So, and we were going to mention the.
Just go through these points quickly.
Okay. Let's go. Okay. So. The Buddha was living in India 2,500 years ago, and India was at that time, as it is today, was a diverse and vibrant culture full of people with all kinds of different beliefs and practices and ideas. And the Buddha engaged in that. And what we find in the Buddhist scriptures, or especially the early Buddhist texts, is that they are full of places where the Buddha was engaging with and dialoguing with and discussing with people following different kinds of religions and paths. This is, in fact, one of the most interesting and distinctive features of the early Buddhist texts, because almost all later Buddhist texts are Buddhists talking to other Buddhists. There are very few exceptions to that. Whereas in the suttas, we find the Buddha talking to people who are not Buddhists. A lot. I mean, obviously he talked to Buddhists as well, right? I mean, there's plenty where he's talking to the monks or whatever, so that's fine. But there's a lot of suttas where he's talking to Brahmins, he's talking to wandering ascetics, he's talking to Jains, he's talking to people who have no particular religious affiliation or interest. And so you get to see how he engages with people from all of those different kinds of backgrounds, which is one of the really interesting parts about the suttas. Now, part of the Brahmanical, obviously one of those diverse strands of religiosity in the time of the Buddha was the Brahmanical traditions. And that was obviously very influential. And part of the Brahmanical tradition is a creation myth, or in fact a number of creation myths we find throughout the Brahmanical literature. Again, the Brahmanical literature is very diverse, and so that's the same kind of creation myth is told in many ways in different contexts. And so we find the Buddha, in a sense, responding to that creation myth, sometimes in quite explicit ways, and it's something like the Aganya Sutta, where that creation myth is actually brought up by some Brahmin students of the Buddha, and and then the Buddha is giving his own account in response to that. So sometimes it's actually quite direct and quite explicit. Other times it's more implicit. And so one of the features of dependent origination is that in some ways it offers not so much a retelling of a creation myth, but it somehow reflects implicitly some of the patterns and the ideas from creation myth. Just as I mentioned before, in Western philosophy, you have some of the problems in Western philosophy sometimes reflect the mythology from which they emerge. And we'll come more to that in a minute. Not self. Okay, so another aspect of Buddhism, obviously very important, is not self, which was a direct critique of especially the Brahmanical idea of the Atman, and also other. It wasn't just the Brahmins, also the Jains had their idea of the jiva, and various other people had various different theories about the self and the soul and so on. But the Buddha taught not self. He said that these teachings of a self are talking about a metaphysical claim of something that doesn't actually exist. So the teaching on dependent origination is a teaching entirely in terms of processes, in terms of phenomena, and not in terms of a self or a soul that undergoes those phenomena. Redefining the factors of existence. What's this one about?
Well, basically, he just talks about things in a new way, like Upadana, for example, has a new meaning in the,
okay.
etc., etc. Avijja
Okay.
has a new meaning.
Okay, so he's redefining various things. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Right. So we'll just begin by just contrasting a few of the basic points of distinction here. In the creation mythology typically talks about how the world is created, whereas dependent origination talks about how rebirth happens. So it's not talking about the first origin of things. So this is obviously one difference. Even when the Buddha did give more of a creation myth, is in the Aganya Sutta, it still doesn't talk about the origin of the world. It actually begins by saying there comes a time when the world ends. That's the beginning, that's the beginning of the creation myth in Buddhism. It doesn't say in the beginning, this is how it's created. It says this is how it comes to an end. So the Buddha was strange. Okay, self versus not self, right? So whatever, desirable versus undesirable. Yeah, good point is that in creation mythology tends to depict creation as being a good thing. And so, we're lucky to have this world because God created it for us. Whereas the Buddha saw that existence was problematic because of dukkha. Creation myths tell things in concrete terms, particular events, people, places, words, and so on, whereas dependent origination is much more abstract. And again, that follows the tendency of philosophy generally to move from things that are more concrete towards more abstract. Redefinition plus polemic. So in a way, the Buddha is adopting ideas and concepts taken from the creation mythologies, redefining them. For example, he will talk about things in a much more psychological sense. So instead of darkness, we talk about avijja. And he's also he's not just responding to it and psychologizing it. He's also implicitly or explicitly arguing against certain of the assumptions embodied in the creation mythology. For example, in the Vedic creation mythology, it justifies the caste system. So according to that, then God or Brahma created the Brahmins first of all from his head, and that justifies the position of the Brahmins in superior position in society. So the Buddha, of course, rejected the caste system, and so he rejected certain aspects of the creation mythology. So here we have Vishnu giving birth to the world. There's a big lotus coming up from his belly again. A beautiful image there. And that mythology of Vishnu's floating in a sea of milk and giving rise to the universe and so on. It's one of the most beautiful of the creation myths. Again, you could argue that it's ahistorical in the sense that that myth didn't appear yet. But anyway. Okay. What I might do, before just going on with this, I might just come, because we mentioned, Nicola asked before about the Bible story. And can we go back to a place where we actually have the 12 links?
Yeah, what about that circle? Is that good enough? Does that do the job? Or?
Oh yeah, good enough.
Yeah.
Can you read the links on that circle, or is it a bit small? It's a bit small, I think. Can we go to somewhere that's a bit clearer? Just the 12 links. And so what I'm going to prove to you is that I'm not going to prove anything. What I'm going good enough. Can we full screen it? Yeah. All right, so here's a standard version of dependent origination. And, okay, so now I'm going to read through the first book of Genesis, just for fun. We're allowed to have fun, aren't we? Yes? That's good. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So we have this idea of that darkness. It's all formless, there's nothing there. And of course this is ignorance, avidya. The Buddha called ignorance mahatamo kanda, the great mass of darkness. Almost exactly the same words as we find in the book of Genesis. Then God says, let there be light. Of course this is sankhara. Obviously, right? That's literally exactly what sankhara is making a wish, making things, we're going to make something happen. Sankhara is the active force. Yeah? Ignorance, out of ignorance you make choices. Was God making a choice out of ignorance? Like if he knew how things were going to turn out, would he have had second thoughts? Who knows, right? Who knows? So the darkness, and there's the wish, and then let there be light. And so light, of course, is a synonym for consciousness, right? So when there's light, you can see things, you can become aware of things. So life is consciousness. I mean, these are not trivial or incidental similarities. This is like point for point, exactly the same thing. So then what happens? He separated the light from the darkness. In other words, creating forms, right? Up till now, everything's undifferentiated. So now we're going to create forms, i.e. rupas. He called the light day and the darkness called night. Now we have names, Namarupa. I mean, again, this is not a trivial similarity. It's like literally exactly the same thing. Let's separate the water from the water. He made a vault separated from the water below and above. He called the vault sky. It was evening and morning the second day. So again, this is continuing that idea of Namarupa, like separating the land from the seas, vegetation, seas, plants, vegetation according to their kinds. There was morning, there's lights, light day, so that goes on with more detail. Living creatures, animals, and so on, be fruitful and multiply, and so on. And he made the wild animals according to their kinds, and so on. So, so that takes us up to about the sixth day, and he creates man and woman. So far that's fairly precise. Now, one of the things that then we have Adam and Eve. There we have the garden. I won't go through all of these kinds of things in the description of the garden. And God puts Adam and Eve in the garden and say, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from that, you will certainly die. and he brought all of the birds and the fishes and the animals, and the man gave them names, and they named them all. So again, we have the name and form. So then, of course, the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom. So here we have the names and forms. We have the 6 sense spheres, because you're seeing things, you have contact, you're seeing this delicious fruit, feeling, craving, and then, and I just want to make a little bit of a comment here, because this particular dialogue is often given to prove that Eve was the temptress, and that she was the one who was leading Adam astray. But I heard a Bible scholar give an explanation of this particular passage, and she pointed out that when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. Right? So she looked at it and investigated it and saw it was good food, it looks good, yeah, and it helps you to gain wisdom. And only then she took it, after she'd investigated and reflected on it and understood it. Then she gave it to her husband, and he ate it. He didn't think about it, right? He just took it and just sort of just ate it straight away. I'm not sure if husband is correct there. I don't think Adam and Eve were actually married, but anyway. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into that. But anyway, you can see this whole thing of like the sense contact, desire, feeling, craving, everything there. And even like literally grasping, like upadana, literally means grasping. I mean, that's what you do when you take the fruit off the tree. You literally, you crave it, and then you grasp it. Then what happens? Then God comes along. What have you done? The serpent deceived me, and I ate. A naughty serpent. And then what's going to happen? The pains of childbearing. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Rebirth. And then they're cast out of the garden. And so they're expelled into a new life, rebirth, old age and death, and have to experience all of that suffering. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, so this is what we mean when we're saying we're taking these creation myths, that same pattern. Now this is, of course, we're finding in a land far to the west. Now clearly the Buddha hadn't read the Bible, I guess, right? But the thing is that creation myths, and this is well known to scholars of mythology, creation myths have very similar patterns wherever they appear around the world. And a lot of these same ideas are found in creation mythologies all over the world. Now, it could be the case that this particular myth was shared historically. There was historical connections between these regions, but really necessary to explain it in that way, because it's, for some reason, there is a pattern in the way that human beings explain their origins. And when the Buddha was explaining origins in terms of dependent origination, he was drawing on these patterns that were already familiar to people. And he was expressing it in a much more rational and philosophical way, rather than through a narrative. Okay, so that's the Bible context. Can we go back now to where we were before? I'll ask my glamorous assistant to bring us back to where we were. Okay.
Where were we?
We were just after that, and then the next one. Yeah.
Next one. Okay. Next one.
Good on you.
Right.
Excellent. So here we're now beginning a discussion of the same kinds of ideas, but from the Rig Veda. So these are examples taken from the paper called
Playing with Fire.
Playing with Fire. PWF, Playing with Fire, by Joanna.
Jurevich? I can't pronounce it.
Joanna. She's Polish. Jurevich.
Something like that. Yeah.
Apologies for mispronouncing her name, but something like that. And she wrote a very influential paper on dependent origination a number of years ago called Playing with Fire, where she pointed out similarities between the creation myth one of the creation myths in the Rig Veda and the dependent origination. And particularly the creation myth she pointed to is a very famous story in the 10th book of the Rig Veda, and the Nasadya story. And it's actually a very beautiful and very powerful piece of writing. I might, Nasadya? Let's see if I can actually pull out the Nasadya Sukta. And I'll just read it. It's a short passage. I'll just read the passage for you to begin with. So this is an abridged version. There was neither existence nor non-existence then, neither the realm of space nor the sky, which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? There was neither death nor immortality then, no distinguishing sign of night nor of day. That one breathed, windless, by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. So you can see that description is, it's quite similar to the description in the Bible of that kind of that darkness, formless, and the wind moving across the face of the world. Darkness there was at first, by darkness hidden. Without distinctive marks, all of this was water. That which becoming by the void was covered, that one by force of heat came into being. Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation? Gods came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? Whether God's will created it, again the Sankharas, or whether he was mute. Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. Only he, who is its overseer in our highest heaven, knows. Only he knows, or perhaps even he does not know. So this is one of the very beautiful verses from the Rig Veda which talks about this, the origin of the world. And you can see that while, yes, there are those similarities and parallels with the Bible creation myth, which is a much more typical creation myth, but here this is very distinctive because it's full of questions. Where did this come from? That sense of wonder. Yeah? Who made this? Where have we all come from? And it's unusual to find in a religious scripture that very kind of naked sense of vulnerability and unknowing, and that ability to make a scripture that's based on that sense of wonder at the face of the unknowability of the world, rather than the pretense that we know it all. Yeah? And that's one of the things which makes this particular passage so powerful and so timeless. Now this passage, part of the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, probably composed maybe 300 years or something before the Buddha. And this is where we can find that emergence of that kind of skeptical, questioning, wondering sensibility into religion, which obviously was something, again, which inspired the Buddha to again, accepting the limits of knowledge. Appearance of darkness hidden by itself, the manifestation of the creative power of the absolute. This is being a create the verb. So the cosmogonic creator's myth, God's wish to create the Atman, is sometimes expressed by the verb sankhara, sankaroti. So the same words used as we find in the dependent origination. Then he devours food with his eating part, thus Prajapati builds himself up, atmanang abhisankaroti, which is the natural consequence of eating. So again, that idea of abhisankaroti, find exactly the same word used in Buddhism, that creating or generating or producing oneself. And again, that idea which is quite distinctive, like a difference or a tendency within the Indic philosophical system, is that one self-generates. Whereas in the Western philosophical systems, it tends to be God exists forever and he creates everything. Whereas in Indian systems, it comes from within oneself. And that relationship with food also comes, the same thing comes into Buddhism. In dependent origination, the Buddha talked about the 4 aharas, the 4 kinds of food. And this kind of food or nourishment is actually one of the primary ways that the Vedic literature talks about or introduces this concept of conditionality. Everyone depends on food, and the procurement of food to sustain ourselves, both physical food but also in a spiritual sense, is a central concern of the Upanishads and the Vedic literature. Okay, so here we have a very dramatic passage. So where is this exactly from? So this is from Playing with Fire, but where is she quoting from?
I don't know, one of the Upanishads probably.
So this is, again, there's a variety of creation mythologies within the Vedic literature. So this is from one of them. He kills the animals, cuts off their heads, puts them on, cuts off their heads, puts them on, and throws the torsos into the water. Then he looks for the torsos, calling them himself. Right, so this obviously is a tale of animal sacrifice. He takes water and earth, which was in contact with the torsos of the animals, and builds bricks. Bakes the bricks in the fire, and out of the torsos of the animals he builds the altar. The heads he puts under the altar. Thus he reunites the heads of the animals with the torsos in the fire altar, which is himself his own Atman, and becomes the fire. It's kind of intense, isn't it? Yeah? It's kind of intense. So here, the practice of animal sacrifice, which is very ancient religious practice, which would have been inherited through the Vedic tradition. It's not something that they made up. It's something which is very universal. And what they're doing here is developing a philosophical interpretation of that in terms of how the self is being built up. We talked a bit about that the other day. I can't remember what did we say about it. We said something interesting about it the other day. I can't remember. I've forgotten now. Anyway, it can't have been that interesting.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things here is the idea of the use of fire as a transformative power, so that energy which is transforming them, but also that idea that there's an idea, like even though it's very kind of gruesome, but there's an idea that that somehow everything here is all connected. Like you're connected, you're part of who those animals are when you're doing the sacrifice. You're not like seeing them as something else. You're seeing them as part of who you are. So that act of creation is through that act of transforming those elements into yourself.
It's also interesting how he actually builds up the Atman out of nothing. It's not really. I mean, he obviously starts off with something. There has to be something in the beginning which does all the creative work, and it builds up his Atman.
Right.
And that is a bit like we build up identity in Buddhism. It's a kind of similar to the papancha process. When you kind of you experience the world, you experience things in the world, and then you build up your identity out of those experiences in the world. It's a kind of parallel to that. Here everything is much more physical and related to the physical reality, but there's something similar going on there.
I agree, and I think actually what I was thinking of before is that this is quite different from the non-dualist Advaita sort of conception of the Atman that we might be more familiar with. The Advaita idea that the Brahman is the self is the Brahman, that the individual is the cosmos, and that idea we find in the suttas as well. But here, the Atman is not something which is just pre-existing. It's something you have to work to create. And you work to create it through all of that pain and that suffering, right? I mean, it's grisly and it's kind of realistic, right? That's actually how life works, that we don't just exist. We have to create who we are, and our existence involves all of this suffering and work and fire and transformation and death, and that's what our Atman is built out of. That's what our self is built out of, and that's kind of how life works, isn't it? I mean, in a very literal sense, you know, we can live because we have a house. The house is built of bricks. The bricks are built out of the ground. They're burnt, and the animals are killed when they're burnt. We eat food, and that causes destruction. And the cycle of life is happening around us all the time, and we are part of it. We try to pretend that we're not. We try to act innocent. We walk down the street and smile at people and pretend that we're not responsible for all of this death and destruction, but really we are.
But what is nice about it as well, he gives meaning to suffering, right? That's what it does, because you have suffering, but the suffering has a bigger purpose, which is the creation of identity and self.
Right, and exactly, and that creation of identity is part of the meaning of what makes the ritual meaningful. Okay, let's move on. So again, from Joanna Jurovic. We may assume that the avidya link refers to the states of ignorance, okay, sanskara, the acts of creative will, vijnana to the subjective manifestations which realize this will. Fine. Means the sequence, avidya, sankhara, vijnana can be used to express the whole Vedic creation. Fine. Okay. So here are some points of distinction. Potential actions, dividing act of building an altar. I won't go through all of these. How's that time going? I won't go through all of these. Okay, so that should be enough for that. And I don't think it's something that we want to... That link between the dependent origination and creation myths, it's important not to overstate it, right? It gives us some context. It shows us that the Buddha was not just inventing stuff from a blank sheet. He was drawing upon the ways of thinking and the ways of presenting things that were current in his time and place, and was shaping them in a new way. Yeah? But it's also important to, we're not saying that dependent origination is nothing but a creation myth, right? It's not reductive. It should be enriching. It should be saying, well, there are ways of looking at it that that can help us to understand it or to frame it through this narrative perspective.
Would have made it easier for people to relate to dependent origination, because they would have some kind of background through which to understand it.
Absolutely.
Instead of just being kind of ex nihilo, something that's kind of out of nothing.
Yep.
They had
Yep.
had a pre-existing structure.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about myths. Now, first thing is I have to say, myths aren't myths. So previously we've been talking about creation mythology, and in that sense we're talking about myths in the real meaning of the word myth, which is a sacred story which supplies meaning for a people. Okay? Now we're going to be using the popular meaning of myth, which I don't like, all right? But we're going to have to do it anyway, because sometimes we do things that we don't like. So here we mean myth in this popular sense of something that people believe to be true, but which really isn't true. Right? Okay, so we clear? Don't confuse these things, because it's very annoying. And I'm... Okay, so here's a list of myths we're going to go through briefly. Dependent origination happens in one life. Bingo. Dependent origination is circular. Bingo. Rebirth and dependent origination requires a self. Stopped between feeling and craving. It means everything is interconnected. And dependent origination is too intellectual. I don't know if we're really going to be convincing people of that one, but anyway, moving on. Dependent origination happens in one life. Do what you want. You have only one life to live. YOLO. Okay, nature of suffering.
Okay, so this... So maybe what we should do is we just maybe start there a little bit more about this idea of dependent origination happens in one life, because this is actually quite, there's many different ways of looking at this. Some people would argue that dependent origination is something that happens moment from moment. So it's like a psychological, the psychology of how the sense of self arises in the moment, and how that leads to the kind of the birth of the self, and how that self dies, in a sense of it disappears again. So you kind of feel a sense of despair when that kind of your identity dies. So from some people, this is a moment-to-moment sequence of phenomena as they arise in your mind. For other people, it's more stretched out in time. For others, again, it's what they call a structural principle. In other words, it is the idea that all of these things, when one exists, they all exist, and they exist at the same time. These are not kind of distinguishable. Time is not really relevant. It's kind of a principle that exists in one kind of moment, if you like. So when there is ignorance, there is also death. They kind of are connected to each other immediately, if you like. So there's many different ways of looking at this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to basically see if there are some arguments in the sutras or wherever that apply and they kind of refute, if you like, this myth in all of these different ideas of thinking about dependent origination in one life. And there's lots of arguments.
The myth tends to suggest that we will find something true.
Well, that's why I'm just kind of making that really obvious. Yeah. So there's no doubt about that at all. So in case you have any, so in case I read myth as you're saying in the wrong way, so we don't be clear about this. And there's lots of arguments. I think you will be surprised how many arguments there is against this idea based on the suttas and based on how dependent origination is understood in the EBTs. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but can I just ask briefly, how many people have heard of this idea that dependent origination applies in one lifetime? How many people have heard of this idea? A few people have heard. Anyone ever heard of this idea?
Yeah.
Most people have not heard of it.
Okay, that's interesting, isn't it?
Most people have not heard of it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
They've never heard people say dependent origination applies in this lifetime.
They have been well educated. Is that because of you, Bhante? Is that
Probably,
must be because of you? Yeah.
So if you explore the lush garden of Buddhist teachings, then you will stumble across this here and there. So this is either because they've been well educated,
here and there, everywhere,
or because they're not educated at all. Which is true.
Sometimes education is a bad thing. Is that what you're saying?
A little learning is a dangerous thing.
In this case, maybe it's a good thing. Yeah.
Anyway.
So,
Nalushi, did you have a question about that? It is an idea which is very popular among secular Buddhists. Yes.
Yeah. Because if you reject rebirth, then you have to come up with an alternative interpretation of these things. Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. Yeah. Yeah, but you get these kind of ideas. Yeah, you do what you want. You only have one life to live. This is kind of the, this is sometimes what is the outcome of these things. Anyway, so let's have a look at some of the arguments against this. And the very first argument is a very obvious one, and that is the nature of suffering as it is expressed in the early Buddhist texts. The nature of suffering is not something that has to do with a single lifetime. It's much broader than that. Dependent origin shows you why there is suffering. That's the whole purpose of it. And suffering is about the samsaric journey, how you get born and how you travel on and how you die and how you go around and around and around. And there are some very vivid suttas about this, about the amount of suffering that you heap up over the lifetimes being like the mountains of bones, and the amount of tears that you have shed is like the tears in the four oceans and these kind of things. Some very powerful similes of the samsaric journey. And these are some of the things that I think sometimes put people off Buddhism once and for all when they read those suttas, and they say, this is not for me, it's too pessimistic. Is that right?
Maybe.
Is that maybe? Yeah, okay. But is it right to think of Buddhism as pessimistic? Or is that wrong? I think the answer is not whether it's pessimistic or optimistic. The question really is whether it's realistic. Yeah, that's really the question. And if you are realistic about your life or about existence in general, then you have the option to do something with it. Yeah, and then the optimistic thing is that there is a solution to the problem. But you have to be realistic to start out. If you're not realistic, you're never going to find any solution whatsoever. So in a sense, being realistic leads to an optimistic outcome. So Buddhism is not neither pessimistic or optimistic, it's just trying to see things according to reality. Okay, so this is the first one. The nature of suffering in the suttas is always about the whole rebirth process. And because dependent origination is about showing suffering, that too must be about the rebirth process. It cannot be about one lifetime. Rebirth is suffering, no rebirth is happiness. One of the kind of famous quotes. This is one of Ajahn Brahm showed me from the moment I was a baby monk at Mahanidana monastery. And he kind of started out showing, this is kind of one of the first things he asks you when you come to the monastery is, do you believe in rebirth? And if you say no, then he doesn't show you the gate, but maybe he should show you the gate if you say no. Please leave through this way. And this is, here you are, this is one of those very traditional suttas that you find. This is in the Anamataga Samyutta, which has a lot of these kind of suttas. The mendicant's transmigration has no known beginning. This is this idea of no known beginning again that we talked about before. From being united with the unloved and separated from the loved, the flow of tears you've shed while roaming and transmigrating is indeed more than the water in the four oceans. one of the things I like about this particular quote is this idea of roaming here, which I think is a really nice translation of the Pali here. Like roaming has this sense of being aimless. Yeah, there is no aim in samsara. There is no purpose. There is no goal. We're not actually going anywhere. It's like roaming in the city. Yeah, when you're roaming the streets of the city, it's like a purposeless thing, purposelessness to it. And this is kind of how samsara is described in the sutta, as this kind of endless wandering around without any kind of goal or purpose or anything like that, which is the exact opposite of the spiritual path, which does have a very clear goal and a very clear purpose. So yeah, I can see why they say pessimistic sometimes. You know, I kind of see the point there. Anyway, that was the first reason. Yeah, that's already good enough. I think that already overturns the whole idea of one life dependent origination, the first one, but we're going to carry on with a large number of other reasons as well. And one of the things about the suttas don't only present dependent origination as an abstract formula, it also presents dependent origination as a real, as how it works out in real life. Yeah, and so we'll show you a few of those. Actually, there isn't that many, so we'll probably show you all actually. Yeah. But this is one from the Mahanidana Sutta, Digha Nikaya. Yeah, if consciousness did not move into the mother's womb, would name and form take shape there? Yeah, it's about rebirth. Yeah, consciousness moving into the mother's womb. I mean, it's pretty obvious what is going on here. Mendicants, when three things come together, an embryo moves in. I think that's your translation, Bhante Sujato. Maybe it's my translation then. In a case where the mother and father come together, the mother is in the fertile part of a menstrual cycle, and the last one, the spirit being reborn, is present. Yeah, then the embryo is conceived. So the spirit being, obviously, the Pali word here is Gandhabba, and you want to tell the story about the Gandhabba? You had a long, fascinating story about the Gandhabba yesterday.
I do.
Was,
I'm not sure if that's going to lead us. Do you guys want to hear about Gandhabbas?
I already heard this. I will take the opportunity to go to use the toilet in the meantime. How's that? That's a good thing, isn't it?
That's an excellent deal. Sorry, I'm just trying to find this particular passage in my translation. There we go. All right, so this particular passage here is talking about an idea of conception. Now, one of the things which is interesting about this passage is that it's found in two places in the suttas. The first place that we're talking about it in the context of dependent origination, but it's also talked about as the beliefs of a set of non-Buddhist rishis, which is something that's quite interesting in the Asalayana Sutta, where so clearly it's not something which is meant to be a sort of teaching unique to Buddhism or a particularly Buddhist account in any way. It was more or less a generally received idea of how conception takes place. So the Garbhasavakanti translated their embryo moved in. I translated it as the embryo is conceived. So these now clearly this is a very natural depiction of conception, right? So you have intercourse, you have the mothers being fertile, and so on. So everything seems, very pretty much sort of just like in accordance with modern understanding of conception, except we also have this idea of the Gandhabba appearing, and the Gandhabba is standing by or is present. The Garbhasavakanti and the spirit being reborn here. So what's going on here with the Gandhabba? The Gandhabba is a kind of mysterious creature in Buddhist texts who often appears as a kind of fairy who's playing guitar and dancing, right? And so then suddenly they're appearing at the time of conception. Is that what's going on? They're standing around having a bit of a song saying, yay, a baby's been conceived? I don't know, maybe. But it all seems a little bit odd, doesn't it? and the sort of the connections between these different ideas. Now, one of the things that's interesting is you have the word Gandhabba, okay, in Pali. In Sanskrit, it's Gandharva, right? In Greek, it's Kantaura, which in English is centaur. That's interesting, isn't it? So the English word centaur is actually the same word as the Pali word Gandhabba. I'm not kidding, it actually really is. So, of course, the centaur being a horse with a human body on the top of it, I don't think it quite meant the same thing here. But there was a fascinating study done on this by, what's his name, Vijayasekara did a study years ago, I think it was Vijayasekara, called Buddhist and Vedic Studies. One of the most interesting and insightful books on this kind of area. And one of the things that he showed was that the different aspects of the Gandhabba that you see in the Pali suttas, all of them trace back to various kind of Vedic antecedents. So what is there's this whole kind of range of meaning and contexts, and we only sort of get little peeks at it in Buddhism because we only see little bits and pieces that's mentioned from occasionally. But one of the things that it seems is that, think about that, what that idea of the centaur is. Okay, so the centaur is a horse with a man at the front, right? Now, obviously, this is a kind of mythological representation of riding horses, right? A man on the back of a horse, right? It's a creature. The Aryan people, the Indo-European people, who were the foundation of both European culture and Indian Vedic and Brahmanical culture, their fundamental cultural breakthrough was taming horses. That's what they did. That's how they came to rule the world. They tamed horses. Yeah, on the steppes of the Caucasus thousands of years ago. And so that idea that you can actually jump on the back of a horse and ride it around and become, in a sense, one creature with the horse, that was that technological breakthrough that ultimately let them conquer the world. Yeah? And so this is why the Gandharva, in a sense, is the almost like the spirit animal of the Aryan people. It embodies their particular breakthrough, their particular genius to be able to tame the horse. But you can see that that also then connects in a kind of funny way with that idea of rebirth, because you have this idea of conveying, right? On the back of the horse, you're being brought from one place to another, you see? And you're travelling across.
You said the spirit being is riding on the horse.
Well, so it's a metaphor, you know. It's like a stork. It's a stork, yeah. Yeah, so it's a stork. So you're kind of, the stork is kind of carrying you down from one, and that's how babies get born, right? Because the storks bring you down, yeah. It's not exactly the same as that, but you can see that there's a kind of similar idea that there could be this divine journeyer, this divine traveller, which would transport beings from one place to another, and then that somehow becomes associated with the idea of rebirth. Yeah, and
the stork and the Garuda are connected as well.
The stork and the Garuda, that'd be crazy. That's ridiculous. Well, I think the Garuda is the phoenix, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, so this is just a kind of interesting point. Again, that kind of connection where, from a Buddhist point of view, we're talking about things. We're used to talking about things in a very naturalistic way in Buddhism, but still sometimes you find these kind of mythological inflections there. And so this is why that sort of somewhat unusual idiom appears in that context. Yeah. All right.
Fascinating. Thank you for that story. That's a really good story. I enjoyed that story. Yeah. I already heard. That's why I left. But yeah, but it's a good one.
You want to enjoy once.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this basically shows us that there is a rebirth process. It's fairly obvious from these practical examples. So we have seen the kind of practical, how it works in practice. We also, and so kind of the evidence is building up here. The first one was about the samsaric journey, is how suffering is defined in the suttas. Then this is an interesting one here. Arahants are conscious. Do you agree with that? Have you met many arahants? Occasionally you meet somebody you think maybe this person is an arahant, because they're very special. And so sometimes you do that. So and anyway, those people that I have met who I think might be arahants, they have been conscious. Yeah. So this is kind of a good reason. So why do I say that? And I say it for the following reason. Yeah, in the dependent origination sequence, from ignorance, you have then the... actually, there should be choices. Don't look over there. So you have, from the ignorance comes the choices, and from that, you, as we said before, you then condition the consciousness, which then re-arise in a future life. Yeah. But the opposite of this is the cessation sequence. So when the whole point of awakening is to abandon ignorance, so you get knowledge instead. And once the knowledge arises, then the choices and the willed activities, they cease, they come to an end as a consequence. And when the willed activities come to an end, then consciousness comes to an end as well. So if everything happens within one lifetime, then the moment you abandon ignorance, consciousness would stop. You see the point? Yeah, that's the cessation sequence down here. Once you become awakened, you become an arahant, then the choices is the end of the will actions, and from that then happens the end of consciousness. If everything happens in one lifetime, that is the consequence of that. But because this is stretched over many lifetimes, you awaken in one life, the willed actions come to an end, and then there is no rebirth, and that is when consciousness comes to an end. Yeah? So this whole idea requires, again, the idea of rebirth for this to make sense. Otherwise, the arahant is unconscious. What does an unconscious arahant look like anyway? Of course, yeah, you must have it. I order you to take it.
Thank you. I submit to your will. And what happens then is you have this cascade effect where if once you take rebirth out, then you have to reinterpret dependent origination. You then have to start reinterpreting what an arahant is, and you have to start reinterpreting what consciousness is. Right? So people will say consciousness. Vijnana means separative consciousness. You see, and V means to divide. So it means separative consciousness. And you find these kinds of ideas around. I mean, it's nonsense, right? Because vijnana is actually explicitly defined as being infinite consciousness in many places, right? I mean, clearly V in vijnana doesn't mean separative consciousness. And yet, so once you start to pull bits out, the whole kind of house of cards starts to collapse, and you have to sort of redefine everything as you go along.
Yeah, I think people don't understand that the idea of rebirth is one of the pillars upon which Buddhism is founded, is based. And almost everything within Buddhist teachings actually falls apart if you take rebirth out, and you have to reinterpret everything here. And this is quite a common thing. One of the kind of famous reinterpretations is the idea, in the suttas we've just seen the second noble truth, that craving gives rise to suffering. Yeah. So one of those reinterpretations is that actually it's not craving that gives rise to suffering; it's suffering that gives rise to craving. Here. Yeah. It's the inverse, and this is one of the kind of fairly modern and it's, of course, there's some truth to that. It's not that it's entirely wrong here. But it shows you that once you take rebirth out, and that also is a consequence of the same idea, once you take some of these foundational pillars out of the Buddhist teachings, everything falls apart, and you have to reinterpret everything, and you're basically creating an entirely new teaching. And this is what is so problematic with this. So yeah, third reason, done. Still only beginning on these reasons why this doesn't work. Reason number 4, D. Dependent origination equals the second and the third noble truth. Yeah, and the second third noble truth, as we have seen, specifically talks about the idea of rebirth, punna bhava. Punna bhava literally means again existence. Yeah, there's no doubt that it means rebirth in that context. So, yeah. Reason number 5. Rebirth vocabulary is used with dependent origination everywhere. I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by that. Really the only way to see this is to read the suttas and to read specifically those suttas on dependent origination, and you will see that the rebirth vocabulary is used throughout those particular suttas. The place to find the suttas is in a place called the Nidana Samyutta. Nidana means like a source, often called the book of causation because it's about causality and sourceness. Nidana is the Pali word. And there you find over 70 suttas specifically on dependent origination. So there's a large part of the suttas, and you also find scattered suttas throughout the 4 Nikayas on this particular topic, very important topic. When you read them, what you start to see, it's very common to see things that have vocabulary that deals with rebirth. So let's have a look at a few of these. When the body breaks up, he goes to a body. Yeah? Rebirth, right? I guess you could reinterpret it. Can you reinterpret it? When the body breaks up, how could you reinterpret that? I'm sure you can find a way. When the mind moment breaks up, the banga jnana, yeah, the mind moment poof goes. Then you go to another mind moment, tick, reborn. Is that possible? Okay, not sure. Okay, does it boggle?
It boggles.
It boggles. Okay.
It boggles.
Because it's not, it's kaya anyway. It's not actually banga, so it kind of doesn't really make any sense. Yep. Anyway, next one. When that consciousness has become established and come to growth, there is renewed existence in the future. The problem is that, you know, if you have to reinterpret things because of a pre-existing view, you always find a way of reinterpreting things. That's the problem with these things. But if you read them in the natural meaning, there's not much doubt of what it means. You know. And I think that's the very important point. We should try to read the suttas as they stand, yeah, as they come to us. We should try to be very careful not to read things into them. And one of the things the Buddha says is that, you know, he tries to use language very carefully. What he says is what he basically, unless there is a very good reason to think that something is metaphorical or it is indirect, and there should be a very good reason for thinking that, you have to assume that what is there is what he says. He's trying to convey a message. If you want to convey a message, you have to make it easy for the listeners to understand, not to make it so complicated that you can't get what he's saying. Consciousness moves in, yeah? Bing. Okay.
Can I just make a couple points on that as well?
Absolutely.
I think one of the things which is to me a little bit, how do I put this? A little bit. Not. Well, do I want to be politically correct? Not usually. One of the things which is a bit disappointing to me, or a bit, how do I put it? I feel that, like, sometimes when people make these kinds of claims or these kinds of arguments, in a sense, they make the Buddha out to be somebody that he wasn't, and they make Buddhists out to be someone that they're not. Actually, the Buddha was quite happy if you disagreed with him. If somebody doesn't believe in rebirth, okay, you don't believe in rebirth, that's all right. And, you know, the Buddha was like, he wasn't going around persecuting people because they had different beliefs. And in a way, there's this kind of almost imposition on the Buddha or Buddhists that somehow we're going to be persecuting people or treating them like heretics because they have a different belief than us. But that's just not who we are, and we've never been like that. And if you disagree, we might have an argument about it, but you have your beliefs, and that's okay. But what really did annoy the Buddha was when people misrepresented him. That he didn't like. Right? If you came up to the Buddha and said, I don't believe in rebirth, I think your teaching on rebirth is rubbish, he'd say, okay, and he'd have a talk about it. But if he'd come up and say, well, I don't think you're actually teaching rebirth at all, and this isn't what you're teaching, then he would come down on you pretty hard, right? And don't misrepresent me. Haven't I taught this in many ways? And I think that it's really important that we respect that and we understand that it's okay to have a different point of view. That's all right. If you disagree with what the Buddha said, that's all right. You're allowed to disagree. It's not going to be struck down by lightning or something like that. You can disagree with what Buddhists say or even with what the Buddha said. Yeah, that's all right. You're struck by lightning, but your head might split in 7 pieces. Is that right? Your head might be split in 7 pieces and struck by lightning. Okay, it might happen. But it seems fairly rare. It's pretty rare. It's pretty rare. It's pretty rare. So just, it's okay, you know, it's okay to have different points of view and so on, but then, you know, if you're reading the suttas and you try to see what were these people talking about, and you can learn from things even if you disagree with them.
Yes, thank you for that. Then we come to number 6. Yeah, we're just kind of piling on the reasons here. Yeah, and this is the idea of rebirth is found in dependent origination in all the various schools of Buddhism. Yeah, it doesn't matter which school you go to. And when I mean schools, what I'm really referring to here is the early schools, particularly where you find the EBTs. According to the Indian tradition, there were 18 early schools. The exact number is a bit uncertain, but there were a large number of early schools, and there's no record of any one of them not having rebirth included in their teaching. Yeah, it's pretty strong. Yeah, and then we come in the modern.
Just as background, there are a list of hundreds of points of differences between the schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
This is not one of them.
not one of them. Yeah.
Yep. So, and that's very, very powerful, because somehow we think that in our modern age, in our modern wisdom, we can kind of overrule, all the ancient wisdom of the all the Buddhist schools in history. And sometimes I think we are just conceited, and we are just, this is just hubris basically on our part. We think that just because we have better technology and because we have whatever, we also have greater spiritual insight. But actually, these two are very separate areas of life. It doesn't mean you have greater spiritual insight just because you have, what is this, Pixel? Just because you have a Pixel phone doesn't mean you have better spiritual insight. No, that's a bit. Sorry, I forgot the connection. I forgot the connection here. Yeah, actually, when I meant iPhone, I didn't mean Pixel. If you have iPhone, it doesn't mean you have greater spiritual. Is that no? I shouldn't say any of these things. So. Anyway, you get the idea what I'm talking about. I'm just messing around. So, okay, let's go on to the next one here.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. So.
Yeah, no, that's very, very quick now. This is quite an important one. This is about dependent origination in Abhidhamma, and there is some modern scholars, and I'm not going to name them because I'm not sure if that is really useful, but there are some very respected modern scholars, even monastic scholars, who argue that the idea of rebirth is found in the idea of dependent origination without rebirth is found in the ancient Abhidhamma texts. But actually, when you look at it carefully, this is what I'm going to show you now. That actually, it is not a very solid argument at all. In fact, it is an argument which is so weak. I wonder how they can even make it, to be honest. So let's have a quick look at this Abhidhamma text, and I'm very happy to say there's going to be a lot of Pali here for those of you who enjoy Pali. Yeah. So this is from a book of the Abhidhamma called the Vibhanga. The Vibhanga means the analysis, and this book of analysis is divided into two parts. One is called the analysis according to the suttas. Another one is called the analysis according to the Abhidhamma. And the analysis according to the suttas is basically the same as you found in the suttas. The analysis according to the Abhidhamma is the new theories that arose when the Abhidhamma Pitaka arose. Please tell me when to stop, Deepika, if I go too long here. And just chuck me out, as I say here, if I go too far here. So here we are, right? Now, the words in green there, these are the words that mean rebirth, yeah? Yeah, jati, sanjati, abhinibhati, patubhava. These are all used generally in the suttas about rebirth, yeah? So you can see here that the sutta analysis and the Abhidhamma analysis both talk about the same kind of thing, yeah? The critical difference here is this word called over here, you say satanang. This means beings, yeah? These are beings over here, whereas over here you have dhammanang instead. Dhammanang means like qualities. Yeah, this is kind of the Abhidhamma way, is a way of analyzing things according to their details, and that's why in the Abhidhamma you use dhamma instead of satta. So instead of talking about the being, we're talking about the constituent factors of a being, like the five khandhas, for example. Yeah, so that is the difference, and based on that difference, then they argue that one of them refers to momentary arising, whereas the other one refers to, a being, in other words, going from life to life. But that is not the point of this thing at all. The point of this thing at all is simply to analyze a being into its constituent parts. But the actual process here uses exactly the same words. Yeah, birth, rebirth, you have it over there, abhinibhata patubhavo. So it just talks about qualities being reborn rather than beings being reborn. So when you look at it carefully, you realize there's actually there's no grounds at all, basically, for using this as an argument that the Abhidhamma teaches dependent origination without rebirth.
It's not an obscure point.
Hold on. Yep.
It's not as if it's an obscure point. Like the very nature and justification of Abhidhamma is specifically that it analyzes what we call a being in terms of dhammas. Like that's what the Abhidhamma project is. Yeah. So clearly, that's a really good point.
And Another kind of a very important point here is to realize that when the sutras talk about momentary arising of things, like the arising of a thought, for example, and the disappearance of a thought, it uses very different words. It doesn't use this kind of word. This word specifically refers to birth and rebirth. When you talk about the arising of a thought, you have words like udaya, udaya, or samudaya. This means the rise in the origin of things. And then you have vaya, which means the disappearance of things, or attagama. And so there are specific words that kind of apply, So you have to know, in a sense, the kind of vocabulary that is used in the sutras. And when you know that there is very little grounds for this kind of argument. So I'm surprised that some of these scholars who in many ways I respect them. They're really good scholars in many ways. But I guess everyone makes mistakes every now and again, except for Bhante Sujato, is that, Okay. So no.
Ask a Calico about that.
We should have some arguments, So
We need to have
to
some
prove,
arguments.
we'll do it later on. Okay, we'll have some serious arguments. We have to hold our hands back so we don't get too. Anyway, okay.
Let's wrap up there.
We're coming to the very end now. I just want to finish this the first myth. Dependent origination includes rebirth in the commentaries. This is kind of the extended literature of the Pali tradition, is all the commentaries and all the kind of larger vocabulary, larger literature, and all of that too has rebirth and dependent origination. And if that wasn't enough, okay, another one: single life advocates do not agree. And as I said initially, the idea of a single lifetime dependent origination, actually there's different ways of looking at that. And of course the reason why they don't agree is precisely because there is no authority. There is no authority on which they can kind of point back to for their arguments. And that for that reason it kind of diverges everywhere. There's nothing they can actually found their arguments on. Whereas if you have an idea of rebirth, well, the authority is right there. It's the sutras. And then you actually have something to point to, and you can find some agreement as to what is happening here. Then comes the very last one, as if all of this wasn't enough. What is the definition of jati in the sutras? Jati is the word that we translate as rebirth here. How is it defined? Is it defined as momentary rising of things? Or is it defined as real birth? Well, I'll let you decide. So this is how you would translate this. The rebirth, inception, conception, reincarnation, manifestation of the aggregates, the acquisition of the sense fields, of the various sentient beings and the various orders of sentient beings. Does that sound like birth, or does it sound like momentary rising of mental phenomena? Another one: rebirth of sentient beings into the various realms of gods, fairies, I like fairies, spirits, creatures, humans, quadrupeds, birds, or reptiles, each into their own realm. Anyway, do we have any more nails for that?
And the same with like old age, right? Old age,
right.
decrepitude, broken teeth.
Yep.
Broken teeth,
Death,
grey hair,
death.
wrinkly skin,
Death.
diminished vitality, death,
Yeah.
the laying to rest of the corpse.
The mental corpse, isn't it? That's the mind moment corpse, I think. Yeah. I think so.
Anyway.
Yeah. Very good.
So thank
Yeah.
you. So I'll just take that through. So thanks everybody for your attention for today's session. We have crammed rather a lot into this session. We've looked at started with a summary of why the early Buddhist texts matter. We've seen how it relates to dependent origination. We gave a bit of a general introduction to it. We talked about the relationship between dependent origination and Brahmanical traditions and creation mythology. We've given some overview of the factors, and we've given a little bit of an introduction to some of the different kinds of ways of interpreting it and looking at it from different perspectives. So that's quite a lot already for one day. So we are conscious of the fact that we are, we're hoping not to sort of overload with too much information. And so it's a bit late for today, but maybe in future sessions we'll try to sort of slow down the pace a little bit and have some more time for some discussion and so on. So, but what I'd just like you to, hopefully we've stimulated some thoughts and some ideas about this, and then if you come back for the future sessions, and if you have some questions, some topics you'd like to bring up and discuss, then that would be really, really interesting. And we are very much interested in that, because we don't know what you don't know. And we don't know if we're just sitting here telling you things that you know, or whether we're actually answering the questions that you do have, unless we get feedback from you. So if you can help us out by giving us some feedback, then we really appreciate it. And it also makes us feel good, because we feel like people are listening to what we're saying, right?